I was thinking if we could broach the more general topic, the TUC in itself.
Yeah.
How many trade unions are you representing? How many are constituting the TUC?
Well, TUC in Manchester has over, let me think, it's near 20,000 affiliated members through our trade union branches. And it's, I think we have 10 individual unions affiliated to us.
Okay.
So we represent quite a number of people here. The national picture is that all individual trade unions, many of whom's flags you can see on the wall there, are all members of the national TUC.
Okay.
And there's something like, I think there's 25 or so individual unions these days. Overall, the trade union movement in this country represents around 6.5 million.
6.5 million, down from almost 13 million by the end of the 80s.
Before Thatcher came to power, it was around 13 million.
13 million.
What's happened is that there was a wholesale assault on trade unionism in the private sector in the 80s and through to the early 90s. A lot of those industries, like coal, like steel, disappeared entirely, and that which was left was totally de-unionized. Okay. And what's happened is that hasn't been replaced. What's happened is that the public sector, which has survived, and some bigger private sector industries which survived, trade unionism is still strong in those areas, but it's not grown into the new industries that have developed since the turn from the 80s to the 90s. So that's why catering is such an important focus, why fast food is an important focus, and also why retail is, because the British economy has been moved over from industrial to a service-based economy, and the union movement needs to move into those areas so it can actually recruit those workers and grow the movement again, because we can't just go on defending what we've got, because if all you do is defend what you've got, you end up with nothing
on the back
in
foot.
the end. You're always on the defensive.
I see. So would you say that, yes, so far the trade unions haven't managed to adequately represent the shift in the landscape?
Yeah, I'd say that's fair. I think there's been a failure to adapt properly for a number of years now. Not with all the trade unions, but certainly with the larger ones. I think the leaderships of them were shell-shocked by what happened in the 1980s.
Yes.
Didn't really adapt as to the changes in the economy, and naturally you spend a lot of time in defensive battles, but where the union movement's been strong is where it's actually expanded.
Yes.
Like at the end of the 19th century, it expanded to include low-waged, unskilled and women workers who were coming into the movement strongly. In the period after World War II, it expanded again to bring in clerical and white-collar workers. And every time the union movement expands, it inevitably brings in a new layer of workers, and it makes the movement stronger as a result. What we need to do now is to go into those areas again, which are regarded as unskilled or low paid or insecure, and that's where the future of the movement is. That's where the movement will find a new layer of people who not just want to get organized themselves, but want to come into the movement and renew that movement again.
I see. Would you say that from the 1980s on, maybe the trade unions have been delegitimized in the eyes of the public, maybe?
I think there's been a conscious effort to do so, yes. I think there was a period probably between the end of World War II and the late 70s where there was an acceptance by the British establishment that trade unions were a part of industrial and political life.
Okay.
I think that the efforts of the Thatcher regime was partly to remove that legitimacy, and also certainly remove any legitimacy around strike action. There's an exhibition now in Stockport Library about a historic strike called the Roberts Arundel strike that took place in Stockport in the 1960s. And though you look at the press coverage of that, even in right-wing papers, it's much more factual, less hysterical, and acceptance of the fact that workers will take action to defend themselves. These days, any action taken by workers to defend their terms and conditions is greeted by the mainstream media with absolute right-wing hysteria. So there has been a conscious attempt to delegitimize trade unions, but I wouldn't be too surprised about that. I think that the actual acceptance of trade unions as a part of political life was due to an extraordinary set of circumstances after World War II, and that as soon as those circumstances disappeared or changed, that the capitalist class reverted back to normal, which is that they don't regard any form of workers' organisation as positive. They will always seek to restrict it severely or get rid of it entirely if they can.
I see. Would you agree with the assertion that um, basically the social progresses and workers' rights that were granted following World War II were some sort of I wouldn't call it distraction, but I mean there was the Soviet Union, the workers' paradise, and maybe the governments in the West had to grant some concessions to the workers to avoid maybe uprisings.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, which is that a unique confluence of circumstances happened in 1945, not just in Britain, but in other European countries and even North America as well.
In France, for example, that's when
and in West Germany and Italy. And what happened then was that not only was there the memories of the pre-war world where the free market style economics had manifestly failed, but also there was the working class of Britain. Many men came back from war not only armed but somewhat radicalized, which is that they'd been overseas, they'd fought in miserable conditions for 6 years in the case of British soldiers. They'd come back and they remembered what happened after World War One, which is that the government of this country lied about providing what David Lloyd George called a land fit for heroes. It never occurred. There was a determination that wasn't going to happen again. So they had the good sense to vote out Churchill. They voted in a Labour government, which initially didn't want to be as radical as it was forced to be, but in the end had to go much further than its original plans were, because there was a very real fear that there would be some kind of uprising, that there would be a revolution in this country. And so they had to go much further in terms of granting more rights to workers, better public services, the health service, housing, things like that, to sort of tamp down the radicalism. And that set of circumstances, which is the visible defeat of the most reactionary form of capitalism, which is Nazism, the triumph of what at least proclaimed itself to be a socialist society in the form of the Soviet Union, and then also the wave of anti-colonial revolutions that occurred all the way around the world. You haven't had that unique set of circumstances since then. So if anybody wanting to understand the world as it is now would do better to look at the world pre-1917 to get a better understanding of how and why the capitalists act as they do.
I see. Would you say that the trade unions can still constitute a vehicle for change, pushing some sort of momentum and maybe obtaining those concessions, those rights that have been granted?
It can. You can still have them as a vehicle for positive change. It's going to be a very hard fight because we're in a society now which is less easily isolated. After World War II, it was still the case that the capitalist world was still a small portion of the world. Now capital is truly global. It can go anywhere and do anything. It's more difficult to sustain the kind of long-lasting reforms that you saw post-1945. But trade unions can still battle, they can still win. It's just that we've got to be aware of the fact that when capital is so mobile, when you now have a truly internationalized system, then what we as trade unionists need is a much broader vision. Socialism in one country was always a temporary measure at best. Now it's even less possible than it was 40 years ago.
Do you think it's bound to fail?
I don't say it's bound to fail. I would say that it's always going to be limited in what you can do.
What you can achieve.
Yeah, if you're restricted to one country when the rest of the world is this globalized capitalist entity, or if you're restricted to a handful of countries even, it's still going to have an incredibly negative impact on what you can do. Whereas the societies created by the Soviet system achieved a hell of a lot in terms of modernizing those countries. Even if you look at a country which is regarded as a bit of a joke, like the Albanian system, that actually achieved a lot in terms of modernizing that country in a way that the previous ruling class couldn't do. But it ran out of scope. See, what that system was good at was modernizing poor countries very quickly through mass mobilization of the labor force.
You've seen the industrialization in the former Soviet Union.
The mass industrialization in China. And then some will say at a very heavy human cost. But then again, capitalism happened at a very heavy human cost. 400 years of slavery, mass expulsions from the land, revolutions, the bourgeois revolutions in Britain and then France and America, which led to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of deaths. Every new system is born in somewhat brutal ways. My point about the Soviet system was that it ran out of energy because because it was run by a bureaucracy, because it couldn't renew itself through democratic means, it ran out of energy and in the end ran out of legitimacy. Because you had the same layer of people running it for 40 years,
so there was still
years.
a hierarchy, and
it was still a hierarchy. It was still a case where, even with all the rhetoric, the working class didn't own that system. They were called workers' states, but they weren't really.
Yes.
They were states run by what in the end was a privileged hierarchy.
The Soviets were deprived of any sort of real power in the...
There was no real power left in the Soviets. They were entirely controlled by the functionaries picked out by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, as was the case in China. In fact, even in official books produced by the Chinese regime up until the early 80s, the function of the party was described as needing to consult the working class, not be run by it. And that's one of the challenges for us as socialists now, which is how do we learn from that system, reflect on what it did achieve, but also then go way beyond it.
I see. Would you say that it's a lack of democracy that maybe led to the failure of those states?
It's partially, yes. For instance, at the end of the 1980s, there were workers' groups in East Germany and other places that wanted to keep the positive elements of those regimes in the forms of the planned economy, the various social benefits that were there.
Free education.
But through the free education system and various other things that were positive. But they didn't want the party bureaucratic dictatorship
controlling it.
Unfortunately, those forces were not big enough or organised enough. The people who were organised was the openly pro-capitalist elements who won out in every society. And that's what happens whenever there's a revolution that's not got an organised political force that can actually push it towards the direction of a democratic socialist system, then other forces are going to seize control of that. If you look at the Arab Spring revolutions, that's also the case. So what happened with those regimes is that you can't run everything bureaucratically. First of all, it ends up being incredibly inefficient. We've all heard the stories about the Soviet factories, one of which was producing boots, the other one was destroying boots and fiddling at production quotas.
Trying to plant oranges in Kamchatka.
That kind of thing. So now I think what we can do is learn from what capitalism's done on a globalized basis, which is that you have now started to develop under capitalism a truly global division of labor.
Yes.
You have countries specializing in producing certain things, some countries specializing in producing other things, with all the potential that capitalism's got, but can't really use because of the contradictions that are inherent within it, national boundaries being one of them. Capitalism, on the one hand, makes national boundaries irrelevant, but it also reinforces them.
Yes.
You don't need to look any further than the British exit from the European Union to understand that. On the one hand, British capital is this globalized entity, the British ruling class, is barely even tethered to this country anymore because
we've seen it in the Paradise Papers, especially.
A lot of its investments are just overseas.
Yes.
But on the other hand, national boundaries are actually reinforced by the fact that capital couldn't truly free itself from the nation state. In the end, the nation state was still the lender of last resort, the guarantor of last resort, and also that national consciousnesses amongst the working class and middle class have survived. In fact, when you were in a crisis, such as we have been now for over a decade, national consciousness, national prejudices grow up again.
So that would be the reason for the rise of far-right parties across Europe?
Yeah, because the far right 20 years ago were still around, but they weren't what they are now. Yes. They were regarded as a fringe joke. But because what they were able to do was they were able to weaponize the failures of European liberalism.
Yes.
And I'd include everything from Blair's New Labour to the failures of the Parti Socialiste in France, the failures of the SPD. All of these tried to become basically liberal capitalist parties while still asking the working classes of Europe for votes. And at the same time stripping out social protections, making the labour market more flexible for capital. Well, if you do that and there's nothing to the left that can come in and explain that situation, then and push people towards a more progressive option, well, then the field's open for someone like Marine Le Pen the Alternative for Deutschland, the Freedom Party in Austria, and various others, including the very far-right Polish government, Viktor Orban in Hungary, to come in with their explanation, which is basically a return to classical fascism, which is stealing some of the slogans from the left, but instead of basing it on class, they racialize them.
Yes.
And with liberalism failing so manifestly and obviously, well, then the far right will always resurge. And that's exactly what is happening now.
So do you think there's been a vacuum in leadership on the left?
There has been for 40 years, certainly in Western Europe. Eastern Europe's a bit of a different situation because you have a situation now where the new ruling classes of Eastern Europe were able to tar anything from the left with the Stalinist brush.
With Stalinist, yeah.
So but in Western Europe, really, there's been a real failure to do anything of any significance on the left for probably since the mid-80s. Certainly since, I think, Mitterrand's surrender in 1981, since Kinnock's denunciation of the miners' strike and any other struggle within the Labour Party and Labour movement here, the total surrender of the German SPD to neoliberalism under Schroeder.
Yes.
All of that means that you've had a generation that's grown up not knowing what even a mass social democratic party looks like, because to us growing up since the early 80s, it was like looking at Tony Blair and the leaders of the Conservative Party, well, they might as well be the same person.
Yeah.
Because they essentially stood for the same thing, which is post-1999 consensus, free markets, some commitment to liberal social values, also
the third way.
The third way, combined also always with rampant imperialism as well.
I see. With the war in Iraq.
War in Iraq, then you've got the follow-up, which is the war in Libya and places like that. All of which has just combined to make a lot of people think, well, what is the point of voting for the social democratic parties when they deliver the same thing as the conservative parties do?
Well, speaking of which, do you think that that Jeremy Corbyn's election at the head of Labour might bring about some real lasting change in that course of...
I think it's an opportunity, which has been reinforced by the disastrous decision of the Conservative Party to call a general election this year. It's an opportunity to at least take the basic ideas of socialism back out to a mass audience again. So when you've now got a Labour Party which has got something like 600,000 individual members,
yes,
and is starting to move in a more socialist direction, I'm not going to be under any illusions that the Labour Party is still an imperfect vehicle. It always was. But one of the better things that it did as part of its history, as any social democratic party did in Europe or anywhere else, was that it made the basic ideas of socialism more widely known, more widely spread amongst the working class as a whole. And if it does that, and if it gets into government, then we actually stand a chance of making some positive changes. But I'm under no illusions, which is that the capitalists of Britain and internationally will fight like hell to make sure that a Corbyn-led Labour government cannot possibly happen, which is why we in the workers' movement have to be very aware of those challenges. And we have to mobilise and organise around, first of all, getting that government elected, but then defending it when it needs to be defended against what will be an inevitable capital strike, runs on the pound. I think John McDonnell was exactly right when he said that they will come for us, because they always do, and they always will. So we have a chance now to do something, but it depends on how strong the movement of the masses can be to make sure that that is defended properly and pushed further when it needs to be.
I see. I'm sorry to conclude on that, because it seems that it always comes down to it. But do you think Brexit, is it a threat or a boon to workers' rights in the UK?
It's at the moment under the Conservative Party, if they had their own way, they would love to turn Britain into essentially a tax haven off the coast of Europe with minimal or no workers' rights.
Yeah.
Fortunately, they have no majority. They're very weak. They're divided and fighting amongst themselves. So it's an opportunity to actually destroy them. Brexit won't destroy the Labour movement and Labour Party. It will destroy the Conservative Party, because they've been split for over 25 years over what their attitude to this should be. Their voting base is often powered by petty nationalism, xenophobia, bitter hatred of, well, foreigners in general, but also bitter hatred of the workers' movement here. with this, you've seen the contradiction ripped apart, which is that their funders, the ruling class of this country and other countries, because the Conservative Party is often funded by foreign donations, really don't want to leave the European Union. They understand that it's been a huge benefit for British capitalism to be able to have that free movement of capital and also the free movement of labour into this country.
It's
often
in their financial interests.
It's in their class interests to remain, which is why all of big business backed to Remainbo. So now the Conservative Party is ripping itself to pieces. I think that it's in our interests to, as Jeremy Corbyn said, try and block any measure to leave the EU, which includes a ripping up of workers' rights, which includes measures to try and turn this country into a tax haven, which is what the Conservatives want to do. And it gives us an opportunity to actually have the Conservatives destroyed, because they won't be able to do two things at once. They can't sell a deal to their voting base and half their parliamentary party that are rabid nationalists, and also please their paymasters in the City of London. They cannot do both.
Yes.
So they're going to end up in a situation where they are ripped apart. And it's in our interest, the Labour movement's interest, to push those contradictions as far as we can, to oppose their deal, which will be a terrible deal if they can even get one, and to make sure we force a general election as soon as possible. And I think that's eminently possible within the next 6 to 8 months.
I see. So on a personal basis, let's say, would you prefer to postpone or cancel the Brexit, or just make the most out of it?
I think on the where we are now is the best position for us to take is that we'd make the most out of it. I think cancelling it isn't going to work for a variety of reasons. I think that what we can do though is if we can force the Tories out, and then essentially we can cut some kind of deal with the governments of Europe, which actually isn't based on xenophobia and closing the country off, but is based on a genuinely new relationship, which is that you retain free movement, but you do it in a way that's not to the benefit of the capitalist class. You do it in a way that's of the interest to the working class of this country and of the European nations as well. Now, you can do that just by simply making sure that the union movement is strong enough in the areas that migrant workers of all backgrounds come into, to actually get them organised from day one, get them into the union movement from day one, and making sure that exploitation that's been associated with free movement is taken away. Once you do that and you get rid of the exploitation, hyper-exploitation and low-pay conditions that a lot of people work in, you'll find that a lot of the xenophobia that's been exploited, certainly amongst the working class, will go away.
Yes.
Because a lot of it's based on economic deprivation that's been exploited by the far right. You can address that by organisation, by making sure that businesses and institutions pay better wages, and you don't need to then get rid of free movement. You can retain that. You can retain the rights of European peoples to come here and work. So it doesn't need to be this sort of horrendous chintzy nonsense that the right wing of the Conservative Party wants. You can create a new nation, a new way of doing things in this country, but it can only be on the basis of a socialist Labour government. Nothing else can deliver that. If the Conservatives try and take us out on their basis, then we need to block it and oppose it.
Considering the actual leadership of the European Union, do you think it's really possible to renew this relation on, as you said, I wouldn't say a socialist basis, but at least one it's a better guarantee for workers' rights?
I think that the people who run the European Union, or more specifically the people that run the powerful European states, Macron and Merkel, have no interest in that. However, you're not just making an appeal to them. One of the strengths of any socialist government should be that it makes an appeal to the peoples of Europe. Say, look, this is what we want to do. Your government is blocking it. So you talk over the heads of reactionary governments to people directly. And also you try and encourage in whatever way you can, the growth of sympathetic formulations in Europe itself, be that whatever the formulations are coming up in France and Germany and other nations as well, the new left parties in Portugal, new Podemos in Spain. You try and encourage them in a way that can give inspiration. And if you do end up with more radical left governments elected across Europe, then the composition changes.
And you might be able to...
Yeah, we might not get it immediately, but by acting as a point of inspiration, you can then actually change the political situation or help to change the political situation in the major countries of Europe.
I see. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
It has been a very pleasant interview.
Yeah, thanks.